All right, so we can see all those who are on the screen, Nathan, Brian, and Tanya. I just want to go around the table here if you guys would just introduce yourselves so those who are joining us on Zoom know who's here.
John Krofchuk.
Andy Los.
Steve Young.
Brian Singer Towns.
Rick Jacks.
Perfect, thank you, everybody. Okay, so what we have here and what I have up on the screen is a listing of the land use designations that we were taking a look at. So currently we have 18 land use designations that are listed, and what I was able to do is eliminate 5 of them and then look at the 13 that are listed on the sheet. So numbers 1 through 4 have to do with mixed use, and they start out with our downtown mixed use category, move into our downtown fringe and neighborhood mixed use. This really mirrors what we have in our zoning code in terms of zoning districts. And that's something that is part of the strategy here to get things to match a little bit better in terms of comp plan and zoning. And so that was the idea behind the first 3. And so those are essentially pretty much the same as what they were before in 2007. Do we think that there are new locations that those designations could be applied to? Yes. And so that's where we'll look at making some of the changes to those top 3. Commercial mixed use is a change from 2007. Before, it was just labeled general commercial. And so all that you had in that area was offices and commercial designation for uses designated for those areas. So think about the area by Menards, Walmart, Highway 61 corridor. And lately we've seen some success in introducing residential uses into these areas just because they are largely compatible with the uses and a lot of the services that exist in these commercial mixed use areas that were just designated as commercial before. A lot of the services are valuable to people that if housing is located in these areas, they can walk to instead of having to drive to. So that's the idea with number 4, is to provide some more flexibility in that classification and allow residential and commercial areas as well as part of a mixed use. Either mixed use among the whole district where you have a residential building next to a commercial building, or mixed use in a single building. Moving on from that, kind of the second area, numbers 5 and 6, limited industrial and office. This is another one where we wanted to introduce some flexibility. In 2007, this was largely reserved for that first sentence there, large indoor office and manufacturing / warehousing with minimal impacts on neighbors. But what we'd like to do is add that residential uses may be located on the edges of the district. So to say that if you live adjacent to, or if there's a residential area adjacent to a limited industrial area, the corner of that limited industrial area could transition to residential. And this would apply to some of those uses that at the present time may not serve the needs of large scale manufacturers, or the buildings might be outmoded, or the parcel's just too small. So the idea is that you wouldn't necessarily want a house in the middle of that, but if you're kind of on the edges or towards the edges, that's where you could start to introduce some residential uses into that limited industrial area, where you have these uses where you're having some manufacturing, but it doesn't generally have an impact outside of the property. So you're not hearing loud noises, there's no dust, there's no fumes. And that's different than the general industrial category, which is some of the more intense manufacturing, think concrete, ready mix, port facilities, etc. And that's really where you don't want people living in the district. Sometimes there are dwellings close by, and that's a lot of the times where we get a lot of complaints at City Hall for fumes, for dust, for the things that I was just mentioning. So trying to, if there's one thing you want to try and keep separate, it's that heavy industrial and residential in the same general area. And I guess I'll stop there. There's 6 numbers, and just see if there are any questions on these so far.
Do you have a layout of what it would look like with these rather than what we have now? Then
No, I do not have a layout. That would be the next step. So taking a look at these categories generally, and if you're okay with these categories, what we would do is apply them to the future land use map. The map that everybody who's here has in front of them is from 2007. I see a lot of the map staying the same, with some significant changes in one area, but more minor changes in the other area. So essentially what we do is we'd use the 2007 map as a base map and go from there when making changes. But after this meeting today, if we're okay with these general categories, if there's some changes that are made, great. What we do for the next meeting is start talking about specific areas to apply these designations to.
Carlos, I'm seeing at the bottom of our sheet here, a fully eliminated 1 and 2 business park and industrial riverfront, and they're incorporated into 2 of these 6 that we've talked about here. So can you describe and speak to this? Are there unintended consequences? I brought this up last time, and I want to make sure that we're not making mistakes. I mean, generally, I'm in agreement. You you present well, of course. What we're saying is convincing, but I want to visit this, so we're not doing things that we deeply regret later.
Definitely. And, you know, I think the business park and the industrial riverfront, really the business park was located in the urban expansion area that goes down to I-90. And I'll talk about that soon here, but that is incorporated into that corridor. So nothing really goes away in terms of the business park designation. The only change is that instead of just being a business park, you could have more mixed use. So people living right next to where they could potentially work. The industrial riverfront is pretty easily lumped in under general industrial, since most of the heavy manufacturing and heavy style industrial uses that we see are either along the riverfront or on the east side of Winona. But definitely, I was keeping in mind the potential for negative unintended consequences. And on my second page, I have some strategies to try and reduce unintended consequences, since you brought it up at the last meeting, Steve. Thank you. So as we go through these, you'll see that it's not listed on this summary sheet, but it is with the detailed information that I'll pass out next. What's emphasized is appropriate transitions highlighted as being very important between different uses and significantly different densities, so that you have gradual transitions or you have buffers. So gradual transitions, think going from a tall building to a medium-sized building to a shorter building. Buffers, think about if you have two different land use designations, they're separated by the railroad tracks or they're separated by a street. So you don't have somebody's house butting right up necessarily against another land use designation, unless it's one that's compatible. And then also utilizing zoning regulations to preserve neighborhood character while allowing for appropriate change. So one important thing to keep in mind with what we're looking at here is these are just general future land use designations. Really what controls what happens at a fine grain level is the zoning. And so that's where this plan is meant to look into the future, make suggestions, but just because something is suggested for an area doesn't mean that that changes everything that is going on with the parcel. One example of that is if we are looking at, and I'll get to this in a few minutes, changing classifications from agricultural to what I'm proposing as residential suburban. The agricultural zoning still stays in place. So that doesn't change anything for the agricultural uses that are being used in the city right now. It just gives them the option, if and when they decide to sell the land for some type of other use, likely subdivision, that they don't have to come to us for a land use change as well as a zoning change. So they would just come in for one approval instead of two. Also, and this is a strategy that I want to flesh out a little bit more with the city attorney, recognizing the difference between owner-occupied dwellings and non-owner occupied dwellings, especially when taking a look at increasing the number of housing choice or increasing the housing choice in the city here. So I think in general, it's easier to maintain neighborhood character if you have more duplexes or triplexes in an area, but they are owner occupied. So you have that person living there that owns the structure. Versus having neighborhoods transition, which is what we saw a lot around the university a number of years ago, from owner occupied situations to non-owner occupied situations. Not necessarily a bad thing, but it's difficult when change, and this is what we saw in the presentation that we had earlier this week. My favorite slide, I think, was no neighborhood should be exempt from change, but also no neighborhood should experience rapid change at the same time. So we have to recognize that things are always changing, things are always fluid in the development and the growth of the city of Winona, but going through that really, really fast change is what we're hoping to address. And so that changeover in the university area from primarily owner occupied to non-owner occupied happened very, very quickly. Not necessarily a bad thing, because if you're going to have students, in my mind, probably the best area and neighborhood for them would be either on campus or adjacent to campus, but just the how quickly that happened, I think is something that really created an issue in that area, as evidenced by the 30% rule that came from that. So that's where it goes back to recognizing the difference between owner occupied dwellings and non-owner occupied dwellings. So I think that that's really one of the key things that we could work with to look at introducing additional density to the city.
So are you saying that putting some teeth into whatever it is? Because what I've seen happen in the past is the city has well intentions, like a natural state area, but then there are no teeth to do something if somebody does in fact intrude into that natural state area. I mean, if we're going to allow owner occupied duplexes or threeplexes, but then and they don't do that, what are the consequences? That's what has to be ironed out. What do you have? What can the government do then to somebody that has purchased and is no longer living there?
One nice thing is that anything that is rental certified, we have to have them, anything that is rental in the city here has to be certified for rental. So what we could do is, if somebody is illegally renting their home, not living there, we would pull the rental certificate for the unit. And then the house would also have to be vacated after a certain portion of time. Obviously, we'd work with the person to figure it out, but there would be some recourse there through that housing rental certification process. But definitely that's not lost on me, and especially in the definition of what owner occupied is. I think we did a pretty good job of that in our current zoning code, but that's also something, if that's going to be a key thing that we're kind of hanging our hat on, we'll want to make sure that that is watertight.
Yeah, there's something you want to, I mean, you can handcuff a homeowner by doing that. For example, I own a house, I get a rental certificate for my basement, and now I'm a duplex. I take a job in another community. Property values are down, so I'm going to rent my upstairs and my downstairs. Now it's non-owner occupied. And so do you pull the rental certificate, or do you allow me to continue to own the home and have tenants in there?
That's a good question. You know, I think that this is a way for us to work with the 30% rule, because that question came up too at the housing meeting that we had. Currently, any property that has a housing unit on it has to comply with the 30% rule, unless you're in an R3 zoning district or in a business zoning district. So if you own a house in an R3 or business zoning district, that owner occupied requirement I don't think is as important. But in the core area of the city, as well as in the suburban areas of the city south of 61, I think that owner occupied component would be more important in those areas, because those are the areas where you see a lot more owner occupied dwellings. But one thing I could see working with is that if you wanted to transition your house to a duplex and a fully certified rental duplex, as long as it's under 30% on the block, go right ahead. But if it's over 30%, you would have gone into the house knowing that the only way that you can rent that second unit is with that owner occupied requirement. So you would go in with the full knowledge, knowing that because the block is over 30%, and this is where I'm postulating that potentially, and this is where I have to check with the city attorney, what we could do is take a look at allowing an exemption to the 30% rule for owner occupied structures in specific zoning districts. So this would allow people who are in saturated blocks to add additional units to their house. It would introduce additional rental units to the block, but as long as there's an owner occupant on that property, it would not count against the 30% rule. So that's one thing I'm toying with in terms of, we're getting into the details and into the weeds here, but introducing some flexibility, yet retaining something that I think a lot of people find important for maintaining the integrity of neighborhoods throughout the city, especially in the core area of the city, north of 61.
But you have still handcuffed that owner as to who they can sell the property to.
Yes, yes, and we have also, and that's a consideration and something that we'll have to talk about. That is also something that happens with the 30% rule. Somebody goes to try to sell their house. If the block's at 30%, they can't sell it as a rental, and that's the number one call that I get every week in terms of volume is realtors calling, can I list this house for rent as a rental, being a possibility on this certain block at this certain address. So.
And we're in the weeds because that's what we're trying to get rid of, is the weeds. I mean, I understand going on this path, but that's what we're trying to solve.
Any comments or questions online?
With the 30% rule, there's pros and cons to it all, but having families live in the neighborhoods is a huge benefit to have that mix, I feel personally. This week, I received a phone call from a neighbor saying, hey, I think there's something going on in the back of your house. Can you go and, check it out? This is nice to have. If there's a party going on, this spring, I had a fairly big party. The neighbor called from down the street. Hey, Andy, you've got a big, not huge, but just letting you know the music's playing loud. A couple text messages to my tenants, and everything's back low, down, and it's nice to have that mix there, in my opinion.
I agree. Very, very interesting discussion. I want to point out what we're dealing with is that government, through the 30% rule, government has intervened and it distorts markets. We've distorted, and the weeds are the distortion. Government has intervened into the market with a 30% rule, and there's some positives and negatives. Totally get it. But now we deal with consequences of that distortion, and these weeds are the distortion in this market. I totally understand what Rick, what you brought up there, of that. That's in my mind that's totally legitimate, and here we are dealing with that problem. I wish there was a way out.
One of the things you can think of it as is if you do the 30% rule to student housing on a block. Someone who attends one of the universities or schools here in the.
Can I see your ID?
Well, I kind of in that impact of it, because you got a single family home. Owner moves out and decides to rent it to somebody who works at Fastenal or something like that. Well, you basically kept the home kind of owner occupied in a way, because it's just still a single family that's in that home. So I'm kind of, that's where I get torn on that 30% rule.
And I can check with that, but I think that part of it, the 30% rule is not without controversy. I mean, it's been litigated, and I wading into one class group of renter versus another group of renter, I think would present some difficulty, especially in the future.
Really?
Yeah.
So, that's one thing. I see what you're saying, Rick, definitely. And I can confirm with that, but my suspicion would be that that would create some issues legally, from a legal perspective.
My first night on the Board of Adjustments, a young man that his parents had purchased a house on campus or close to campus. And he had graduated, and then he said, "Oh, I want to keep the house and rent it out because the market's down," exactly what you said. And we had to say to him, "Sorry, no, you have to rent it out to only one person." It's like tough sled. I don't know exactly whatever happened to him, but it should have been student housing. But because of the 30% rule, it wasn't allowed. It had been up until he moved.
This is Nathan. I just want to point out that the car rental companies and VRBOs a lot of times, and hotels even, will have limits and say you have to be 25 years old to rent this thing. So that it would be pretty easy to set an age limit, maybe, if that's what we're concerned about.
You got housing protection and discrimination laws that I really think would be difficult to write. I mean, good thought, but
Some flexibility that we currently do have in the 30% rule was introduced as part of our zoning code rewrite. So for instance, we allow owner-occupied dwellings to have a rental certificate and rent out dwelling units. A rental certificate for one dwelling unit and have a certification for up to 2 rooming units. So if you have an owner-occupied property of people who are cohabitating, for instance, you could have 5 people on a rental property, but it has to be owner-occupied. Another portion for flexibility that we have is if it is just occupied by the son, daughter, or relative of the person that owns the property. So say your parents buy a house for you, as long as you're not paying rent to your parents and you're just occupying the house, then you can go ahead and do that. And we do not consider that a rental. So those are, but that person could not have roommates because that's where the rental comes in. So, but previously there was some question as to, what are the limits on family members, and it's father, mother, brother, sister, and there's a couple more, but we define that in code. So we have introduced some flexibility, and with the owner occupancy versus non-owner occupancy, I do see that as a potential strategy to introduce even more flexibility in addition to rezoning areas that are currently R2 to R3 as well. And that's actually, I think, the next section on my summary. So we'll back up here on the slide a little bit. So we talked about the first 6, the downtown mixed use and downtown fringe, neighborhood mixed use, and commercial mixed use. By the way, all of these classifications, the 30% rule does not apply in these areas. It also does not apply to any residential dwellings that are in the limited industrial area or the general industrial area, as long as they're already certified. So next would be residential classifications. And so what I looked to do was to collapse, I think it was 5 different classifications into 3. And so what I took a look at doing was collapsing the low density classification into what's called suburban residential. And basically that would apply to anything south of Highway 61. And this is too where areas that are currently used for agricultural purposes would be classified as suburban residential south of Highway 61, but that ag zoning would still stay in place. So that's a way of maintaining that use and ensuring that that's not changing until that property owner wants it to change. Second would be traditional neighborhood, and this is largely the same as what we have in the existing core of the city north of Highway 61 in residential areas, but it would also introduce the ability to have those corner shops. Right now, places like Blado's, the High and Low, Poots Tavern are outlawed. You can't have them. But what we would do is look to allow those uses, but with limited on a limited scale so that they can fit in with a neighborhood instead of being a neighborhood nuisance per se. The final thing is multifamily residential, and this would be in the highest density residential areas. These are areas that are currently zoned R3. We actually have a lot of areas zoned R3 on the fringes of downtown and then south of Broadway that are designated for traditional neighborhood, but are already zoned R3. So to me, it makes sense in those areas to just go ahead and designate them as multifamily residential. But also areas zoned R2 with 60% plus of the lots on the block that are rental, so non-owner occupied rental. And that's, again, where the owner occupancy classification comes in. There's a number of blocks and that surround the university that are over that 60% number. And I just put 60% on there because you could start with 30% and basically flip the 30% rule on its head and say, if 70% of the lots on a block are rental, non-owner occupied, that that's a good candidate for being rezoned to R3. But then also, if you take a look at 60% too, that's pretty good saturation of rentals as well. So that's a number that I've been working with, at least in terms of taking a look at potential blocks for redesignating to that multifamily residential. But the key is the owner occupancy. So I'll back up a few steps. The blocks at the last meeting, we had talked about 2 blocks on the east-west side of campus in terms of WSU, looking at potential for multifamily residential and potential rezoning to R3 in those areas. The key with that R3 is that the 30% rule goes away. It does not apply in the R3 zoning district. But on a lot of those blocks, when the 30% rule was being established, the people who are owner-occupied, living in owner-occupied structures went out there and got certificates. They're not renting them out, but they're just sitting on the certificates. And so that's where, if we're looking at transitioning blocks to R3 from R2 and allowing the full block to go rental, it's important for us to take a look at which blocks have full rentals, that there isn't a number of property owners just sitting on rental certificates. So that's kind of a fine-grained nuance that I think would be important to do because these people have made investments in the areas that they live in and want to stay there. Not to say that in the future that couldn't change, but that would be something that, in my mind, we'd want to take a look at when looking at changing over from R2 to R3 with this multifamily residential designation. So that's a lot, and I'll just pause there in terms of the different residential categories.
What do you see like suburban residential? Is that going to be rural residential, and what other zonings would go into that?
A rural residential, ag, residential suburban classification.
Because one of my concerns is if we can find new areas to bring into the city, we're gonna have to have some density. And right now the rules for rural residential are big lots, half-acre lots, which we don't have the land to do. So what is a rezoning then that has to take place?
Yes, there would have to be some rezoning that would take place, but this would open the door to allow that. Whereas right now, if it's designated for low density residential, you have to go for a comprehensive plan change too.
And this would avoid that?
This would avoid that.
That would be good.
Carlos, of these three, which allow for, and then what's the limit for multifamily dwellings? You know, so in suburban residential, can you have duplexes, quadplex? Where does it, if so, where does it end? Same for traditional neighborhood. Multifamily, can be duplex on up to big apartment buildings, right?
Great question. And so that gets to my second document here, which is the detailed document. And I apologize, those online might have a little bit of trouble because it is pretty detailed, but we will have this up on our website so that you can reference it in the future. But I'll just go ahead and pass it out to those that are here. And if you just give me 1 second to pull it up. All right. So in order to implement the strategies that I was going through in the summary, what we would do is look at amending the descriptions in the sections of the comprehensive plan. And so just to start out with, right at the top, I wanted to make sure that in this plan, we define for Winona, what is low density, what is medium density, what is high density, because it changes depending on wherever you live. And this is consistent with what we have in the zoning code. So again, it's trying to, align the comp plan and the zoning code where possible and where appropriate. So in this document, in the next 11 pages, wherever you see low density, what that would refer to is one dwelling unit per parcel. But that also includes twin homes on separate lots where essentially, for all intents and purposes, you have two houses that just happen to share a wall, but they're on separate lots. Medium density, what we'd look at that as being is 2 to 4 dwelling units per parcel. So duplex, triplex, and quad per parcel. This would also include attached dwelling units or townhomes with 3 to 4 units on separate lots. Think of the properties off of Glen Echo, Janet Marie, some of the projects that John worked on. So that we would consider that medium density. And then the high density, really what I try and do is mention high density in the definition, but then call it multifamily after that, because I think high density kind of rubs people the wrong way and can set off alarm bells. When really what we're looking at is a natural increase in value for a property and introducing greater housing choice, which I think needs to be the focus rather than that high density terminology. So that would apply to 5+ dwelling units per parcel. So apartment buildings, and it would also include attached dwelling or townhomes with 5+ units on separate lots. So even if you had 5 dwelling units or 5 townhomes on separate lots, if they're all attached, we would call that multifamily or high density.
What's the difference between parcel and lot?
It's the same thing.
One dwelling unit per parcel.
Yep. So what I could also do is say includes attached twin homes on separate parcels. But it's just a nice way of not saying parcel, 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 parcel all the time. Which is fun to say, but kind of looks funny. But yeah, they're synonymous. So taking a look, moving through those definitions and the question related to residential suburban. And so you'll see in the details how for some reason, this is, hold on 1 second.
Carlos, this is just for clarity's sake, this is what we're proposing to move to?
Yes.
This is the proposal, okay.
Yep. All right. And for some reason, this is not.
Well, maybe I missed it. Why am I not seeing low density where it would have the option to be able to have a duplex on it? Or isn't that what we've been talking about?
Yes, and so that would be, for some reason, my document isn't showing the changes here, but so what's coming up online for those who are online, the track changes are not being shown, so it's just the final document, which I think is okay because I think it'll be easier for you to read anyway. So what we'll do is get to the residential suburban section, and let me find that real quick. All right. So you see the description on residential suburban. For those that are here, do you have a page number? Page 16. And so this is the classification, that residential classification that would apply south of Highway 61 within city limits. There would be a different classification that would approve in expansion areas that we haven't talked about yet, but this would just be within city limits. And this is where you get to that mix of housing styles, predominantly single or two family residential dwellings. So that's where you're acknowledging that this classification, even in low density areas, you can have a duplex in there. So it's predominantly either single family or duplexes in these areas. You could also have small scale residential, or sorry, small scale commercial interspersed in higher traffic areas. This is where we talked about that, you know, at some time up on the bluff, would it be nice to have a corner store up there so you don't have to drive down to get eggs and milk all the time. Located in higher traffic areas. Obviously, you don't want to plop that one down in the middle of a neighborhood, but at the same time, that commercial use isn't going to want to be in the middle of a neighborhood either. They're going to want the visibility and, you know, that type of thing. Also, medium and high density residential included as part of subdivisions approved after adoption of this plan. So that's taking a look at, you know, if you're going to introduce medium and high density residential, that it's part of new subdivisions. You're not necessarily taking over existing subdivisions with anything more or introducing any more change into existing subdivisions. The biggest change would be going to a duplex. This is just preliminary, but it's my attempt at introducing change into single family areas that would probably, in my mind, be very interested in retaining that character in the near term. That being said, should some duplexes and should, you know, the desire for change in those areas be greater as part of this plan, we can definitely change it and, you know, allow that for existing subdivisions. We could also, in another 10 years to 15 years, when a comp plan is redone, start to open those areas up a little bit more. But this gets back to that gradual change for a neighborhood instead of wholesale change right away. My attempt at trying to institute that. And then the last part is existing agricultural uses are accommodated through zoning regulations. So I mentioned that a couple of times. Also, as part of this classification, you have here conservation development, steep slopes, sensitive natural resources. That's in our existing plan. So we would continue with that. But this next section is to consider such areas for recreation, such as hiking or mountain biking trails where appropriate and potentially to meet park dedication requirements. And Brian, this is kind of where with St. Croix Heights, we were looking at those outlots as meeting the park dedication requirements, thus making things a little bit more flexible for a developer. So, you know, instead of having to provide that, you know, traditional park with a play set in it, instead for the park dedication requirements, what you could do is take a look at potentially establishing areas for hiking trails and public use on steep sloped areas.
He has park area that they can't maintain now, so. Well, it's true.
Yep.
So we don't necessarily have to have more parks. The other thing though, that you mentioned, we were talking about slopes. Is there anything gonna change for that? We've got an ordinance that's way over the top as far as slopes. It really cuts out a lot of land that should be able to be developed.
And so in addition to this document where we take a look at the zoning, the land use designations, if you take a look back at our 2007 plan, in addition to these designations, there's goals and objectives. And I would see that as coming in one of those goals and objectives that may be outside of this. There's no reason why we couldn't mention that in here, but that would be detailed in that area. Specifically, let's take a look at the Bluffland ordinance where it can be, where we can make it more flexible in areas outside of the Mississippi River Valley. All right, just continuing on, another bullet point in terms of design for and density for the residential suburban classification. It's kind of bifurcated on 2 pages here. And if you just give me 1 second here. So what we're looking to do is encourage small sized lots and dwellings consistent with Winona's historic development patterns as a way to increase unit counts in new subdivisions and facilitate financial feasibility. So this is where for new subdivisions, we'd look to allow and not just have those large size lots, have the ability to do homes on smaller lots to increase the unit number and hopefully make things more financially feasible so we can get more subdivisions. Also incorporating connections to adjacent subdivisions without needing to return to a subdivision entrance. I think when you see one choke point, and that's especially exemplified by Mankato at 61 right now, one entrance, one exit, you can see how when you have that one, a lot of times it's just fine in a residential subdivision, but if you can have some redundancy, connection to an adjacent subdivision, not only is that good for access and circulation, but it's also good for, you want to take a walk. You don't necessarily have to go out to the county road, walk along the county road and go in another, you walk among neighborhoods essentially. And then finally, new subdivisions may be laid out in interconnected grid as a way of protecting open space, promoting walkability and interconnected street network, ease of navigation. And Luke wrote this, you can tell, but he's really good at describing how in new subdivisions, a portion of that could be, due to the topography of the land, I think the traditional subdivision design with winding streets and a cul-de-sac is going to lend itself the best to, a lot of bluff top locations where you have fingers of developable land extending out to points. But in some of the more flat areas, can you introduce a grid pattern in order to introduce some additional density, smaller lots, and some of that redundancy and the things that Luke talks about here, so that you have that greater diversity of housing in new subdivisions, greater diversity than what we see in a lot of places right now. So
interconnected grid pattern are streets that run parallel and at right angles to each other. I mean, is that what that means?
That could be part of it, but it's also just making sure that you have maybe an entrance and 2 exits, or 2 exits, 2 entrances.
Let me just point out, when we did this subdivision, originally, we were going to have, it was going to be cul-de-sacs. But what we did was we talked to the owner next to it and said, hey, listen, let's do this and plan it so we can do a loop rather than having 2 cul-de-sacs. Some people get excited because you're going, oh, you're taking my land away. Well, no, it's just good planning. And that's what we're here for. So yes, rather than have all kinds of cul-de-sacs, and you may have to in some areas because you can't do a loop here, for instance, it makes perfect sense to do that. So you end up like, I think Brian could talk to that about his project, the St. Croix project, how it was added on to the project that we did earlier.
Yeah, what aspect did you want me to dive into? The loop, like the road loop?
Yes, I mean, along the eastern edge of that property, we have a road that just stops, and that was going to be, you were going to continue on with that rather than just doing all into one subdivision and go back out to the road. They would have actually been tied together.
Yeah. The roadblock we ran into on that is it would have extended through what's considered the bluff impact zone. And one of the variances that we went for to make that happen got denied. So we just eliminated that altogether to make all the roads stay outside of that bluff impact area. So that's why we couldn't just extend that through.
Well, and this is where some flexibility, may come in with the comp plan saying that this is an important thing to have. And that's part of the consideration when you go for a variance is, is it in line with the comprehensive plan? And this was an area too, where you're kind of on a back valley. It's in the Bluffland area, yes, but by putting a road in that specific location, as long as it was engineered correctly, which I'm confident that Brian and his team would have done, and it wouldn't have hurt anything essentially. And there's ways to mitigate and account for some of the natural resource impacts and the potential for erosion. So that's what the engineering would do. But this is something that would help to provide that flexibility and hopefully help if somebody's looking to do that in the future and they're not allowed to get the variance in order to do so. Okay, we transferred to the detail document, and that might be something you want to take a look at, and maybe chew on a little bit before our next meeting. But the last thing I do want to go over, since we're coming up on our hour here, is the expansion areas, which are the areas outside of city limits. And so I'm going to stop sharing on this one and go back to our summary sheet that we were looking at earlier. Okay, so now just taking a look towards the bottom of the first page there, numbers 12 and 13. So what we had looked at previously was allowing more flexibility instead of having those blobs per se. I still haven't come up with a better word than that, but allowing instead of those blobs of specific uses such as industrial, such as mixed use, such as business park, in urban expansion areas. So extending out from where the city currently is to the Interstate 90. What we do look at doing is establishing corridors, use corridors. So that first corridor would be along County Road 17, Pleasant Valley, where our utilities are already extended. And this residential corridor would be focused on residential with the ability to have some of those corner stores type of thing. But you wouldn't have necessarily those commercial uses introduced or at a large scale, or the limited industrial uses at a large scale. So this would be a residential corridor extending out to where the city has extended utilities, and would allow development in that area, having a mix of different residential uses, similar to what we have in that residential suburban classification, where it's predominantly single, two-family, but you also have the ability to introduce medium density and high density housing as part of a larger overall subdivision. So you have that mix of uses in a new subdivision. And 13 is the Highway 43 and County Road 44 residential, commercial, and limited industrial corridor. Again, the reason that limited industrial is included in this is we already have utilities at the top of the bluff on County Road 44. Are there areas, are there uses that could be introduced in those areas that do not impact surrounding uses? They have design, aesthetic, regulations and considerations that help them to fit into the surrounding agricultural and residential uses. And they're either next to where our utilities are, or we don't have to extend them all the way up to the top of the bluff along Highway 43. So that opens the door for the potential of that to occur in the area closest to where we already have utilities, and allows that mix of uses, residential, commercial, and limited industrial. Again, that flexibility, and with modern manufacturing and modern commercial uses, there is the ability greater than I think there really ever has been to have them be compatible with residential areas. And in addition to, as part of this classification, when you get into the details again notes that you want to mitigate the potential for any adverse effects from industrial uses. So if you get an industrial use in this corridor, this is where we'd probably look at having an industrial use allowed with a conditional use permit. So it would go to the planning commission. Planning commission would say, that's great, you want to put a warehouse up there, but you know, these are the conditions that would need to apply to the property in order for it to fit into the neighborhood. They'd be reasonable conditions, but just conditions to help to make sure that it doesn't create issues in the area where it's located. Any comments or questions on those two?
Carlos, you must, on points 12 and 13, these are very brief examples of what you're proposing. You must have a lot of verbiage behind those points 12 and 13. So for example, a question that would come to mind on point 12, County Road 17 residential corridor. In that corridor, would you support twin homes, duplexes, the conversation that we've been having? So that's incorporated in there? Okay, how would I know that? How would I see that?
Yep. So if you go to the detailed document on page 21, and since we've gone through this on the summary document, I'll also bring it up for those who are online. And we can add some additional verbiage, but we do note the mix of uses, mix of residential uses for new subdivisions. You see the description of that corridor is just those 2 bullet points right now. We can add additional ones as needed, but then you'll see the description for 43 and 44 as well. And I'll just mention the first bullet point that you see there, fiscal impact analysis appropriate prior to extending utilities into these areas. So that's where our speaker this week just drove home the point of, when we take a look at extending utilities, we need to take a look at current costs, but also future costs and what the cost is at maintaining those utilities and our capacity to do so. We don't want to overextend ourselves, and that was a dad joke. Significant extension of utilities, the second bullet point is being preceded by master planning of expansion areas. So you want to, if you're going to extend utilities, makes financial sense and it's a huge project, great. Like we use the terminology when we were working on our latest annexation agreement, extraordinary project. So say Amazon wants to put in a distribution facility and employ X number of, thousands of people. Okay, yeah, maybe that's yeah, exactly. Well, but something like that happens. Okay, it's one project. But if you're looking at extending utilities, to support future development, we want to make sure that we have a good plan for that area before undertaking something like that, if we've shown already that it makes financial sense to do so. So that's where these bullet points come in as just guidance for the future in this area if we're looking at extending utilities south of the city along Highway 43.
You have extended utilities on County Road 17. I mean, they're already there. So making use of that structure that's already there makes perfect sense. Up Highway 44 or 43, more importantly, doesn't make quite as much sense because there's very limited land available on 43, and you have to go a long ways before you'd ever be able to pay it back. 43 and 44 is a different scenario. So I really look at only 2 corridors, 44 and 17. Those both have huge potential for a payback.
And I think taking a look at the fiscal impact analysis will help with that. I don't necessarily want to close the door on that, even though that's where fiscal impact analysis could come in and say, hey, you know what, it's understood that it's going to be millions of dollars to extend these utilities. Maybe they will not, maybe there's some concern that they will not pay themselves back, but, according to this analysis, at least we have some evidence that it might, or that it would. So that helps us to have the conversation at that point in time with some data, but doesn't close the door, essentially. And we are at 9:33. I started a little bit late, so we go over just a few minutes here, I think is fine. Are there any closing comments? Otherwise, I do want to try and schedule our next meeting here before we adjourn. I know it was kind of like drinking from a fire hose today, so take this with you, and we could talk some more at the next meeting, definitely.
One of the things that we talked about was putting like an age restriction for certain rental units. What's a 55 plus? If I'm 50, I can't live there. I'm being discriminated against, right? So
That's been established as part of housing law, that you can do 55 plus and 62 plus.
Young
geez.
people are not a protected class. Yeah, you can discriminate against young people.
To the property owner at that point, so. Okay, so it doesn't sound like we have any, other than Rick's comment, any other additional, any other additions to the meeting. So if we're taking a look at 2 weeks out, it would be July 7th at 8:30. If we're taking a look at 3 weeks out, it'll be July 14th at 8:30. This time seems to work well for everybody on a Thursday. 7th or 14th, any preference or conflicts? You'll be gone on the 7th, okay. Does the 14th work for everybody? Okay. You would be able to zoom in on the 7th. But okay. And no, you don't have to. It's okay to miss it, but yeah, just trying to get as many people as possible. So, all right. So we'll look at July 7th at 8:30. Yeah, we'll send out an invite. Luke will send that out so we get it on your calendars. And again, I thank everybody for taking a look at this today. And next meeting, we'll talk a little bit more about this and then start applying some of these classifications to our future land use map. So everybody have a good couple of weeks. We'll see you on the 7th.